he had a desk in the main room. And in the back, people were waiting to come up to his desk to talk to him. And one day I was standing next to him, and a lady said to him, "Would you come and bless my son who's in a wheelchair?" Father Solana said, "Why don't you have him come up and get a blessing himself?" And he goes like this, and the fellow got up from his wheelchair and walked up to Father Solana's. And I witnessed that myself. And he got up, and he walked right up to Father Solana's desk, and he gave him a blessing. That's the first time I saw a real miracle happen right in front of my eyes. But I heard many, many, many things like that all my life. And then I lived with him at Huntington. And he was sent to Huntington because he was so overwhelmed in Detroit that he couldn't get any rest. So they sent him to Huntington, Indiana. And then carloads of people would come down to see him. And I remember in the dining room, he had a bell, a symbol of 3. When that would ring, then he would go upstairs. And that was going on constantly, even during the meals. And I remember he sat about the second one in. So the poor Capuchins on the dining room had to push the dining room table out, and then he would come in. And in those days, we kissed the floor every time we left. And he was old at that time and had arthritis. He always knelt down and got up, and then he had to go up the steps. And then he'd and then he'd come down and start eating, and the bell would ring 3 times. And he'd get up, and that would happen constantly. That's the one I noticed most of all when we ate, because there we saw him. Well, I just knew about him. I used to serve Mass for him, and that was wonderful too. But he would, there was nothing unusual as Masses. He didn't spend a lot of time at certain parts of the Mass, but he was always very reverent during it. And he used to call me by my first name when he met me. Well, in those days, it was all in Latin. And so he would start at the foot of the altar with the prayers there, and he would be very absorbed in what he was praying, even in Latin. And at the consecration, of course, that was the most interesting to watch, because he would bend over and he would whisper the words of consecration. And I used just to stare at him at that time because of what was happening there. And then when he would receive communion, he was totally absorbed in what he really was receiving at that time. And then at the end of Mass, we'd always get a blessing from him. And he put his hand on my head, and he'd give you a blessing like that. And of course, on St. Patrick's Day, I always made a big fuss over him. And what I really admired about him was the fact that he was a simplex priest. He was not smart enough to pass the final exam for ordination. And in those days, if you didn't pass the final exam, you couldn't be a priest. You were called a simplex priest. In other words, you could say Mass he couldn't hear confession. That might have been a great blessing for Father Saladas not to hear confession. Otherwise, he'd be totally absorbed forever. So, but I always admire it. We used to say among ourselves, he kind of showed us all up. Us smart ones that became priests never got to be that holy. But to this day, I think one of the most profound statements must have been in his deathbed when he said, when he was dying, I offer my whole life to Jesus Christ. And then he died. And I thought, that was his whole life. To live with somebody like that is totally absorbed in the life of Christ. And to live with him and to see him and to see the amount of people who came from Detroit, which is quite a distance, that I would say that bell rang constantly during the day of people coming from Detroit to see him. And he was sent here to get him away from the big crowds. And finally, Father Gerald Walker became provincial. He was in Detroit, and he brought him back to Detroit so that he could die there. And of course, and then when they exhumed him, he was incorrupt. You know, Rome says when you're part of the process of canonization, you have to exhume them to, quote, count the bones, you know, to make sure he was. And I remember seeing a video of that, of the fellow who had to open up the coffin, because by that time it was all rusted, the locks, and he took a wrench and he opened it up, and there he was, incorrupt. So all we did was put a habit on him and reburied him.